Good morning, everyone. It's so lovely to see you, and thank you for being here for our first panel of the second day of our conference. This panel is on gender, media, and politics. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our first group of presenters, Eva, Tanja, and Milica from Italy, Slovenia, and Croatia, respectively, for a presentation entitled Character Assassination of Female Journalists, Actors, Channels, and Methods in the Digital Environment.
Thank you very much. Wow, like a rock star. Good morning, everyone. I have to say that I'm very impressed how many of you showed up this early this morning. You know, I was very concerned about myself showing up, but I did. Unfortunately, one of our co-authors is still not here, but we are very hopeful that she will arrive at some point during the presentation. So this is collective work that we've been doing with Tanja and Milica. And it's a research in progress that looks predominantly at the concept of safety of journalists. So what we're trying to do with this very comprehensive research and the holistic approach is to operationalize a bit better. What do we mean when we speak about safety of journalists? So looking at the dimension of physical safety, digital safety, economic safety, which is becoming increasingly important, legal safety, and why this matters. So why are we even interested in safety of journalists? Thinking from the perspective of democracy and the area of policy. So what is actually policy doing to safeguard journalists as key voices in democracy? We do this work with plenty of methods, so document and media analysis, case studies, in-depth interviews, policy analysis, and so on. And we are specifically looking at how digital transformation and digital technologies are playing a role in this. Increasingly artificial intelligence, and especially generative artificial intelligence, across all these different dimensions of safety, but then also looking at how AI is actually playing in the creation of this content, dissemination, amplification, and the gender dimension of it. So I'm super happy to discuss with you all these different elements, but of course, because of the lack of time, we won't be able to go into details on all of this. Why are we at this conference? Well, we actually learned about the work on character assassination from our colleague who was here visiting Fulbrighter, and we learned about the work of the group, and we thought that this is, it's beautifully, not in a good way, but in a good scholarly way, matching the theory of chilling effect that we've been operating within. And somehow this gave us more nuance into looking at how characters are being assassinated as an additional element of safety of journalists that is killing the reputation, which is then killing the foundation of trust in journalism as a key democratic institution. So this is how we can somehow bridge these two areas. And I'm very curious whether any of you here in the room recognize this lady. Her name is on the screen, but I would be curious to see if any hand can indicate to me that you recognize the face. Okay, so that is great, but also not that great. I'm going to give you a little bit of a story behind this lady. Her name is Daphne Caruana Galizia, as you can see. She was a journalist, investigative journalist in Malta. And she was assassinated in October 2017. They blew her up, literally, in front of her house in Malta. So this was the first assassination of a journalist in the European Union in 25 years, and really changed the course of our understanding of safety and the conditions in which journalists in Europe operate. After her killing, there were several other assassinations of journalists in the EU, in Slovakia, in Greece, in the Netherlands, and in a few other places. And so what we've seen is a really negative and worrying trend, because these journalists were not killed because they reported from a war zone. They were killed because they reported on a high-level corruption. Linking also to the conversation of yesterday, why is Daphne interesting, is because there is still a lively debate whether we should consider her a journalist or not. She was extremely brilliant investigative reporter, reporting, for example, on Panama Papers, specific cases linked to Malta, for which her son actually won a Pulitzer Prize because they were working as a tandem together. But at the same time, she was running this blog, Running Commentary, where she was entering the private sphere of politicians that she was scrutinizing as a journalist. And many would say that she was crossing the border too much into their private lives. So kind of assassinating their characters as well. So it's a very interesting dynamic between them. And there is a very lively discussion still whether she is a journalist or not. She is also relevant for the history of journalism in Malta because she was the first journalist ever to sign under the opinion pieces column. So not a female, but any journalist ever in the history of Malta. And there are other reasons for which she's a relevant figure that changed the course somehow of also like policy development in the field of media freedom and journalism in Europe. And we're super happy that Milica joined us. She's the third co-author of. And it's also Mariana's fault that we are in the story of character assassination, so she's the one to blame. Now I'm going to show you an image that is rather graphic and can be a little bit disturbing, but I think it's important to show it to understand the context around the character assassination of Daphne. So before she was literally assassinated, her character was assassinated systematically over the period of her career of 30 years. So this is the digital dimension that we're speaking about. This is the AI used in generating these kind of illustrations and images. And this was published on Facebook literally a few months before she was assassinated. And what you see rounded here is a like by member of a parliament. So member from a Labour party in Malta. So just to understand like how these environments operated at the time. So I will not go into too many details, but here you can see her, for example, on a billboard. So in electoral campaign, she was a part of a negative campaign. So her face was placed on a billboard, blaming her as an enemy. So if you vote for the other side, or if you support her, you are supporting the other side. They call her Witch of Bidnja, which is the region in Malta. And you know that witch for women is one of the most dehumanizing terms. And she was labeled like this for several decades of her career, very often by Labour Party officials and supporters. So the political actors, and just a side information, but an important one, is that Labour Party is a ruling party currently in Malta, and it has been a ruling party for a while now. I show you a doctored image. There have been many of these, a lot of trolls, online hater campaigns and groups, mostly on Facebook because this is the most popular social media in Malta. And this campaign continued for several decades. I mean, not on Facebook only, but then it shifted to the digital sphere. And it continued as well after her assassination. So even years after she was killed, some of these groups were really, really alive and operating. And when she died, she had 40 slaps, so strategic lawsuits against public participation, that according to the law in Malta, her family inherited. So they couldn't mourn their mother, they had to go to court to defend her reputation. This is from her blog, and I think the second quote is a really telling one, showing us to what extent she was aware and she was responsive to these attacks and intimidations and threats and attempts to really assassinate her character. And I think this sentence is echoing, especially now after everything that happened. She said that I've been the target of these relentless assaults for almost 3 decades, but none of it worked because of my personality. And I would like us to stop here for a second. And then she adds, do your worst, you bastards, until the only option left to you is to take out a contract on my life, which actually happened a few months after this statement. So to this day, almost 8 years after, we still don't have a mastermind convicted. We do have a person in court, but the process is taking really slow, which is another message of impunity in this case. This case somehow changed the awareness in the EU and made us realize that the safety of journalists is not something that is guaranteed, quite the contrary. It also provoked, on the other positive side, much more engagement and awareness on the side of academia, civil society, but also in the area of policy. And we have, for example, a very good initiative that was established in collaboration between civil society organizations and journalistic associations. They established in 2020 the Media Freedom Rapid Response, which is a platform that monitors or records all the cases of attacks to journalists, classifying them across different dimensions and criteria that I will show you a little bit. I will show you a little bit how it works. But then they also provide support, like legal support and other types of support to journalists that are affected with this. So this is the platform. It allows you to search about, based on the type of incident, source of incident, context, who was attacked, what kind of individual journalist, so whether this journalist is a freelancer or working for a media organization, whether it was an individual actor or group of actors, gender dimension is covered as well. And then also looking at some specific topics or areas, including AI. So to what extent AI was involved in these kind of attacks. And here you can see some very brief snippets, like descriptions of these cases. If you open each of these windows, then you can get much more details about each case, additional reference and resources. So for us academics interested in this topic, this is an excellent repository to start investigations from, and we've been using it for this project extensively. So just some numbers. So the repository has been operating for less than 5 years, so established in 2020, but gathered already almost 5,000 alerts involving more than 8,000 persons or entities. Here are just some highlights from the database. So what kind of incidents appear most frequently are the verbal attacks. So again, it's threats, intimidations, but many different forms of attempts to discredit someone's reputation through AI, but also more traditional means. What is also super interesting is to look at the sources. So the most frequently appearing group of sources are governments and public officials. Gender dimension is also interesting because in the overall number of cases, male journalists are more frequently target of such attacks. But when we look at the AI specific cases, then female journalists are more frequently the target of those attacks. And what kind of techniques we're seeing? Well, plenty of techniques, but what is really on rise is AI, the use of AI, in manipulating images, video, voices, impersonation of, or manipulation, for example, in elections, then the use of deep fakes to create porn, so to put a journalist in this very sensitive and somehow personally affecting context. A lot of use of journalists, their faces and their reputation for advertising illegal businesses or for fraudulent gaming apps, so earning money based on journalist reputation, destroying this reputation, and then really causing negative effects on already fragile trust in media. And I think this is a very important aspect of this. So just to wrap up somehow, because we are coming to the end of the time allocated to this presentation, what we are somehow drawing out from this analysis is the individual level impacts. So the harms are obviously to the individual, to your freedom in doing your job professionally, but also affecting you emotionally, personally, your emotional well-being. There is clearly a chilling effect, silencing effect of these kind of smear campaigns and other kind of attacks. It affects willingness, especially of young journalists. So future journalists, journalist students, to join or stay in the profession, because why would you do that? It's already, well, it's poorly paid, and then you also need to face this. Then there are clearly democratic implications, undermining press freedom, already fragile and declining trust in media, with serious consequences for democratic orientation if we lose these voices of reference in our democratic societies. Then I think what is very interesting, what we discovered, is stigma. So journalists are much more willing to speak about these threats and campaigns that when they happen to other journalists. They are very supportive, but they don't want to speak about themselves. There is something almost like a shame. You know, it's almost like if they are weak when they speak about this. And to a large extent, they accept this as being part of their job, which is complete nonsense. It shouldn't be. And there is a role for policymakers to make sure that this is not the case. So I'm not really sure about the context in the US, and I would love to learn more. But what we have in Europe is so-called enabling environment, which means that countries, the states, they have obligations not only not to interfere with media freedom, but also to provide enabling environment, so safe environment for journalism to flourish in economic terms, but also in terms of safety. And there is this paradox of the enabling environment if you connect with what I said before. So those that are supposed to safeguard or protect journalists are very often, and too often, the main perpetrators of those kind of smear campaigns and attacks on journalists. And I think this you can really relate with the context you have in the US. And just to close, from Daphne case to Daphne's law, Daphne really did trigger a lot of developments, positive developments in Europe, at least in the policy area. So we have anti-SLAPP directive. We have, for the first time, a European Media Freedom Act, so trying to protect media freedom at the EU level, not being able to rely on individual member states to do that on their own. We do have recommendations at the level of Council of Europe and at the level of European Union that are trying to, put high on the agenda the issue of safety across all these dimensions that we discussed. But then, of course, this will all boil down to political will to really and truly implement this in practice. And so for the time being, I will stop here, and I'll be very interested in exchanging with you on this. Thank you very much. Yeah.
So if you have to exit the room, please exit through the back door.
Let's see. All right, excellent. Thank you for our wonderful first presentation. Our next presenters are Kevin and Matthew from Southern Utah University.
Thank you. And that was an awesome presentation. I really enjoyed that. You did a great job. I'm here with my colleague, Matt Barton. He and I have published a lot over the last 20 years, and people joke that we have like a hive mind. So right now he's telling me to tell you that he's smarter than me, more handsome than I am, and a better writer and researcher. So we are interested in memes. We did a study on attack memes against Kevin Spacey and also memes during the COVID-19 crisis and pandemic. And so I don't know, we love doing this and can't believe people pay us to look at memes and to, but we decided to focus on, and you'll see some similar themes from earlier presentations, except we're kind of focused on an attack framework and how that applies to these memes. But so we looked at memes against Hillary Clinton, Kamala Harris, and Trump from both of his cycles. And 2016 was pretty unique. Hillary was the first one to actually ascend and win the party's nomination and run in the general election. That had never happened before. We'd had vice running mates on the ticket, but never in the general election. You had Hillary, who had been around for a long time, right? It's already been pointed out. She was a state senator. She was Secretary of State. And Donald Trump, absolutely no military experience, no political experience, a lot of reality television experience. So that was quite a contrast. Not that there's not anything wrong necessarily with having little political experience going in, but that was the case. One thing that was interesting is these candidates had the highest unfavorability ratings. We'd never seen that before, where they were over 50% unfavorable for both of them, and across a wide range of character attributes. So people were puzzled across the world at how did we end up with these two when nobody even likes them? So that's interesting. They were both dogged by scandals. Other differences, gender ideology, presentation style, and obviously the skin tone, but I don't really think that's a deal breaker when it comes to politics. But in 2024, that was interesting. We had a presentation yesterday that pointed out how unique that was for Kamala Harris as she kind of took over some of Biden's delegates when he dropped out. That was interesting. They were both the oldest candidates in history. And obviously, there was speculation that Trump was trying to evade some of those criminal charges, and that had already kind of happened since he ascended that second time. I missed the top one. It's only the second time in our history that we had a presidential candidate lose and then come back and seek the nomination again. I think it was Grover Cleveland was the last one. So it's a pretty interesting campaign. I had a student come in that was like, why are you guys studying memes? Memes are old. You guys are old. Don't you know that people have moved on to new and better things? And we're like, no, memes still matter. They're kind of in a different form. You're seeing some like video or GIF memes and stuff like that. But in its essence, they're still there. We kind of define memes as anything, whether it's a video or an image that has some text like superimposed on it. It's not a complicated definition, but that's kind of how we operationally define it. But I mean, look, the global meme industry expected to be 6.1 billion. I'm not a finance guy, but that sounds like a lot of money to me. 30% of people aged 18 to 36, which is not my demographic, but take their word for it, will share at least one meme every single day. They're easy to construct, they're easy to share, more capable of going viral. It's already pointed out that there's value in memes because they can have kind of a disarming effect on people. We know that's true with other kinds of messages in pop culture and things too, where if people don't realize they're being persuaded, they're more likely to be persuaded. And so I think memes fill a really important function in our culture, and they tend to be more complex. Out of their studies on Kevin Spacey memes and COVID memes, we established that memes can have really biting kind of social commentary. And so people are really quick to dismiss memes, but they actually are very complex and have some deep messages there. Not a huge sample, but we looked at 198 memes. You know, the internet's a big place, and it's hard to get a sense of everything that's out there, but we did our best to scour the internet for as many memes as we could find on Trump. We would search for Trump or Clinton and campaign and the year, and then we just go through and find whatever we could. We're not trying to generalize. We're just trying to get a sense of how well this framework applies to these memes. And so I don't know if you're that familiar with Benoit's framework. Most people are. I worked with Bill for years at Missouri and since while I was there. And I think it started back in the early 90s when he was doing a study on the Clinton and Bush and Perot debates. And then he did an analysis of Dateline NBC's attack on Walmart and the tobacco industry PSA attacks. And at that point, and for several decades after that, it was simply a framework to examine how people are attacked for their behaviors. So how to increase their level of responsibility for an offensive act, and then how to increase the offensiveness of that act. And surprisingly, this conference is all about character assassination, but that adjustment to his framework to include character attacks didn't come until just a few years ago. And I find that fascinating, especially since you'll see as I work my way through these, the majority of our meme attacks were on character. So the initial framework would do very little to explain anything happening in these memes. So it's kind of fortunate that I'm not going to review all these strategies here, but as we go along, I'll talk about the strategies that were there and what they mean. So I'm skipping there were a few attacks on actions, but I decided to just forego those because of the nature of this conference and just focus on attacks on character. So one of Benoit's strategies for character attacks is to argue the accused has performed acts consistent with the trait. Okay, so let's look at this first one. We've got Hillary Clinton and some of her previous scandals and associations, and then you've got, if she were a molecule, she'd be a ho. And so it's not really hard to see what they're arguing here. They're arguing that she has a trait of being sexually promiscuous, or Hillary has the trait of having shady associations, being maybe unethical or lacking integrity. And so they perform acts consistent with that trait. So a shady person that has that innate characteristic is going to engage in shady activities, right? So they're trying to make a connection between attack or action and character. And then obviously, if you have tendencies toward being sexually promiscuous, then that's what you're going to do. Okay. And then similar to this is there was a whole theme of these, and I thought they were so funny. Memes are funny how they tend to like cluster around each other. Well, you'll see one and somebody will say, that's funny, let me do a variation of that. And so you've got a lot of people riffing on Trump's cabinet picks, you know, where why is he choosing these crazy people to be in his cabinet? So they're like, you know what, we'll reduce this to the absurd and have him pick, you know, character from Arrested Development, from The Dune, and then I don't know if you've seen Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And then I'm not a huge Doctor Who fan, but I think that's the Daleks are the bad guys from Doctor Who. And so they would be great as for in the Department of Peace and Compassion. I think that's meant to be a little sarcastic or ironic. But the act consistent with the trait is, what's the trait? Donald Trump has poor judgment about people and their qualification, and he exercises that judgment by appointing people that are not qualified to be cabinet members. Then one of his strategies is accused has made statements consistent with the trait. This is a little similar, but instead of using that trait to engage in an action, you use that trait and exercise that through your spoken words, what you say. So here you have Hillary Clinton is untrustworthy, or I would say more like evasive, right, in her answer. And so she might, this is a hypothetical, right? She never said this, but we like to put words in their mouths. I did not delete emails. They were, well, it's complicated. So an evasive person would say something like this. Kamala Harris's characteristic is she can't keep her words straight. There was a lot of what we'd call word salad memes where, you know, they're quoting her as being nonsensical. And so that's the trait connected to this hypothetical statement that she might make. Trump says, I don't always run for president, but I try to offend as many people as possible. So they're saying that he is an abrasive person. That's his trait. And so he exercises that by saying things that irritate people. Okay. He's also kind of a hypocrite, you know, is the argument when he says, and may lightning strike me down if I lie. So the assertion there is that he'll say things that are really inconsistent with his behavior. Okay, then there's a strategy of associating with people who share the trait. So Hillary is often equated with her husband, Bill, like they come from the same two peas in a pod kind of thing. So he says, I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. And she says, I do not have textual relations. So it's kind of a guilt by association type strategy. This one's obviously Hannibal Lecter is a fictional character. So she's not really associated with Hannibal Lecter, but they're making an assertion that what is Hannibal Lecter's primary characteristic? I don't know, scary, manipulative, dangerous, cannibalistic. Kamala Harris, I would say not maybe cannibalistic, but maybe evasive, maybe dangerous, you know, just like Hannibal Lecter. They're trying to, you know, tarnish Trump's reputation here by saying like he's associating with crazy evangelicals that all are kind of this homogenous type of group of people that are like, thank Jesus for Trump. Trump even said in I think one of his speeches recently that God preserved him for this great purpose, you know, and so they're associating him with this movement. And that's meant to tarnish his reputation. Another strategy is to contrast these people with those who don't share the traits. So, for example, they make the argument that these are not typical politicians, right? So these people are weird. Like, how did we get these guys, you know, instead of normal politicians? So it's setting up that contrast, which is kind of interesting. They do this economically by saying like Kamala Harris and Hillary Clinton were kind of born with that silver spoon, and they're wealthy, and they're mocking them for trying to relate to people that actually came from poor conditions. So that's kind of an interesting strategy. I'll move forward to one of the more interesting ones to us is Bill Benoit has this category of exemplifying the trait with a particularly offensive example. And that's obviously subjective, right? Like what somebody finds offensive. But we thought these maybe push the line a little bit. Obviously, that's meant to be a sexual innuendo rather than coughing from an illness that came on. So that was interesting. And then if you see the text there, that's implying that it'll be better when Trump's dead, and wash your hands after urinating. So I think these maybe go a little bit farther than some of the other memes. Some of the conclusions that we have are memes tend to have kind of a reductionist quality where they make people not complicated anymore, and they simplify their characteristics to like the most base level. So that's why the title of the presentation is the Orange Emperor, the bitch, the slut, because that's all you are in these memes. And it's meant to be simple and digestible and leave you with an impression of that candidate that's just really palatable. They argue that Harris only advanced because she used her sexuality to advance, and that was a theme that you saw earlier in presentations. There's a cool piece that suggests that this comes from an old trope of women as prostitute, where you're either in the home or you're out there publicly as a prostitute, that you don't have any other choices. It sets up kind of a false dichotomy there. And that we thought it was interesting that in spite of all these sexual allegations against Donald Trump with, he had the thing with grab him by the, and then there were accusations of rape and sexual assault. None of those were present in the memes. So this is a conference on gender. We have to ask ourselves, why do people that both have things in the news following them not have those present in the memes? Memes are often connected to the news cycle. We found this in our study with COVID memes too, that a lot of times the memes are reflective of what's being talked about in the news. So somebody will mention something. Some of the media personalities came up with this hashtag, heels up Harris and Joe and the hoe. And then all of a sudden, somebody tweeted those in social media, and then they started emerging in memes. And so a lot of times, the thing to keep in mind is that the news is sometimes driving the content of memes. Not always, but a lot of times it does. And so we thought that was pretty interesting and something to look at. In the end, I would say that Bill's refined framework of attack, including character, applies really well to some of these visual types of messages, and that it doesn't work for everything. I see some thematic analyses using grounded theory, and I love inductively building themes without applying a preconceived notion of a theory, because you find different things different ways. But I do think this is an effective way to look at how memes attack. We also determined that, how much time do I have? Like none? Okay, I'm so sorry. Okay, those are the last two things. So attack and character are connected with each other. So if you attack somebody's character, you're also attacking their actions, because if you're a bad person, you're likely to do bad things. And if you attack their actions, they did those actions because they probably have a poor character. But we argue that it's probably more effective to go the other direction and attack the character and let the audience sort of fill in the premise that this person's likely to do things that are bad. Okay, and then a shameless plug, which I would argue is not that shameless, because everyone else is talking about their books too. So it's not, there's no shame in that. But we just had a book that applies this framework to a bunch of different cases using this theory with Bill. And so that's out now. And then I have a website called Public Apology Central that looks at responses to attacks in a whole bunch of different cases. So that could be a good teaching tool for you if you use attack and defense in your classes. Or okay, thank you. If anyone wants to use this clicker, they're more than welcome.
Leave it plugged in for now. Don't forget to take it when you leave.
Yeah.
I will say, just as we're getting the next presentation queued up, I also found in my thematic analysis the intertwining of character and policy attacks that were sometimes actually difficult to distinguish. All right, so now we'll move on to our third presentation by Newly from the University of North Texas, comparing conservative and liberal media's coverage of Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson's appointment to the Supreme Court. Is that? Oh, this one. This is the one that's on, JK.
Okay, here we go. So on June 30th, 2022, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson she became the first Black woman who was appointed Associate Justice to the US Supreme Court. President Joe Biden nominated her in February after Justice Stephen Breyer announced his intention to retire. It's very interesting to look at the sort of the backdrop against which she got nominated and confirmed to the Supreme Court. These are just some numbers from other, what should I say, like trailblazer candidates who also were on the Supreme Court. So just for comparison's sake, Justice Jackson's nomination was by a very close vote, 53-47. All of the Democrats voted for her. 3 Republicans crossed the aisle and they supported her. Just for comparison, Thurgood Marshall, who was the first Black man to be on the Supreme Court, he was voted by 69-11 margin. Sandra Day O'Connor, she was the first woman who served on the Supreme Court. She won by a unanimous vote, 99-0. Sonia Sotomayor, the first Latino person who was confirmed to the Supreme Court, she had 68-31 votes. So you can see that the nomination process has become increasingly partisan, and that was reported by a number of media outlets. So against this particular background, my paper looks at how conservative and liberal newspapers covered the nomination and hearing process of Justice Jackson. And I think that this question is very important in today's high choice media environment where a lot of people might not be exposed to political views that they do not subscribe to. So just looking at what the literature says on this topic, I'm drawing broadly from 2 strands. One is looking at how women of color have been covered in the media, and the other is looking at how political ideology colors media coverage. So just broadly, some people have already talked about this in yesterday's session, but just broadly, a lot of, when we look at how women of color are covered, we see that there are a lot of differences there in the tone and amount of coverage they receive. Typically, they tend to get overlooked. They get less amount of coverage compared to their white or male minority candidate peers. When they are covered, they tend to receive a lot of negative coverage. And they also tend to receive coverage that focuses a lot on their novelty, just because there are fewer women of color running for office and even fewer who get elected. Journalists tend to focus on the historicity of their nomination, the historicity of their win. While that is not objectively bad, what happens is that coverage comes at the cost of issues. So issues, their record, their viability as a candidate. So all of that gets sacrificed at when you just have coverage that focuses on novelty and why they're so historic. Looking specifically at media coverage of women who have been appointed to Supreme to the Supreme Court. There isn't a lot of scholarship on media coverage of that, but whatever scholarship exists, that finds the same patterns of coverage for those women, that they do receive less coverage, and then whatever coverage they receive tends to talk a lot about their characteristics. So their intellect, what kind of a temperament they have, those kinds of things, and not as much on their record or their ability, and so on. So the other part of literature that I draw from is political ideology and how that colors media coverage. Just objectively speaking, journalism as a profession, journalists are supposed to follow professional rules of being neutral, being fair, following some of the guidelines for covering news, for collecting news, for writing news, all of that. But that is not to say that, political ideology does not affect coverage at all. It does affect in some different ways. One way is that political ideology could affect who is in the newsroom in terms of editors, reporters, and that is important because they are the ones who determine what gets covered, what gets left out, what kind of a slant is in the stories. So in that sense, ideology could affect media coverage. Looking at previous studies that have examined how political ideology has affected coverage of women, some of the scholarship, it's actually kind of divided. Some scholarship finds that, that coverage of women is influenced by political ideology. They do tend to get negative coverage. And then others have found that regardless of what the ideology is of the news outlet, journalists in general tend to ignore women candidates running for office. They just tend to focus more on the male candidates, and that is regardless of what kind of ideology that news outlet has. So in general, they tend to think of male subjects as more newsworthy, more worthy of coverage, and so on. From all of that, I come to this broad research question: how did conservative and liberal media outlets cover Justice Jackson's nomination and confirmation to the Supreme Court? So just a quick note about the method, data, all of that. So this was a mixed methods approach, and I got stories from the nomination period, which was in February of 2022, the Senate committee hearings in March of 2022, the voting period, which was in April of the same year, and then the oath-taking ceremony, which happened in June of 2022. And for liberal outlets, I was looking at New York Times and Washington Post as my sources. And then I got Fox News, National Review, and Washington Times as conservative news outlets. This was all from previous scholarly research that has looked at these particular sources as examples of left and right. I also ignored things like opinion columns, fact checks, those kinds of things, because I wanted to focus only on the news aspect of the coverage. At the end of it, I had about 36 articles from the liberal media outlets and 32 from conservative media outlets. And then I coded all of these for mentions of race and gender, judicial experience, intellectual abilities, and the overall tone of the article. And each of these were coded at 3 levels for positive, negative, and neutral. So moving on to the findings, some of the findings were expected just along what previous research has found. So in terms of mentions of race and gender, I did find that liberal news outlets were just in general more likely to mention the race of Justice Jackson and also provide positive coverage of that. Same for gender. Conservative outlets were very, very neutral in their coverage of race and gender. And in terms of statistical significance, there was none in terms of negative coverage of race as well as gender. So in that sense, this was interesting. And when I mean positive coverage of gender, I mean that did they talk about the historic nature of her appointment? Did they highlight race and gender in the front part of the story? Did they talk about her in terms of why her nomination was so historic, those kinds of things? So that is what I'm talking about here. And then the next thing I looked at was judicial experience. So did they use positive phrases like, extensive, superior, impressive, high level, these kinds of things to talk about her judicial experience and what kind of experience she had in the past. So here I found that liberal news outlets were more likely to mention it and to provide positive or neutral coverage. Conservative outlets had a more negative coverage of judicial experience, and the next part of it might explain why they had that. So the next part being the qualitative part. So this one that I looked at was her intellectual prowess. So looking at what did they say about her characteristics, her ability, her intelligence, those kinds of things. And here, I was looking at, did they use positive phrases like brilliant, smart, leading judicial scholar, all of those things, or implicit references to her intelligence by talking about which institutions she went to, she attended, so those kinds of things. And here, there was no negative coverage at all in any type of news outlet, but the liberal news media were more likely to mention her intellect and talk about it in a positive or neutral way. For the overall tone, liberal news outlets were more likely to have an overall positive and neutral tone, and conservative news outlets were more likely to have an overall negative tone. So then I just did a little bit of a deep dive to understand why these patterns were occurring, and could something explain what was going on. So the big thing I found was that liberal media were covering her in a completely different way. The type of articles they were writing about her were more detailed. They were giving it a feature type of a treatment, which means that they had more of a scope to insert description, commentary, details about her experience, get quotes from a number of different types of people. So that's what it says here. The sources of people who were quoted in those stories were very varied. They included politicians whose quotes tend to be very negative, or it tends to be very, very pointed and very opinionated. But they also included other people like activists and just average Americans. And they were trying to say, what does this nomination mean to you? Do you think it's going to affect something? So that kind of changed the tenor of the story and the way it was reported, which is why some of those findings can be explained by the treatment that they gave. And then other things were, they did background or contextual stories where they were looking at where she grew up, what kind of people shaped her ideology, how her beliefs were shaped. So those kinds of things, which gave more of a context to how she might have ruled in the past, or why she believes in certain things, which changed the nature. For the conservative news outlets, I found that the stories were extremely factual and they were really short. So they just stuck to the who, what, when, where, why sort of pieces. They sort of avoided going more into context, background, those kinds of things. And they just stuck to what was happening, the he said, she said, and they quoted mostly politicians, and they tended to be very, very partisan in their quotes, which is why some of those findings were showing that their coverage tended to be more negative. And then they also focused squarely on her judicial record, on how she had ruled in the past. Unlike previous scholarly articles, which have found that the media tend to focus on women's personality, their personal lives, those kinds of things, I did not find any of that here, but the coverage was squarely about her, how she had ruled in the past, and trying to tie her to liberal ideology. So in terms of future research and what all of this means, I think the departure from just the broad trends that we see in existing research about how the media cover women of color who are running for office is very interesting, because I didn't find evidence that they were focusing on her traits or her characteristics, but that they were looking more at her experience and specifically how she had ruled in the past. So that was interesting. The liberal outlets, it showed expected patterns of coverage. The conservative media had an overall negative tone, but then it was again driven because of the way they were reporting, that straight news, just fact-based, that kind of stuff is what drove it. And then going forward, if I were to make any changes, I think I would like to do a comparison with the other justice who got elected fairly recently, Amy Coney Barrett, and see if there are any changes or sorry, any differences that come up in how the liberal and conservative media covered it, and also compare coverage longitudinally. So just look at changes over time and see if there are any patterns that have emerged in the coverage. But that's all I have. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Newly. Let me pull up our final presentation of our panel this morning. Please. All right, 'tis indeed. Oops. Using a computer while other people are watching you is like the hardest thing in human existence, gotta say. Excellent. So our final presentation on our panel for this morning, and then we will open the floor for questions, is from Marko from SP Jain School of Global Management in the UAE. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Jerry, very much. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having patience and eagerness to wake up early for this session. So much appreciated. Before I start with the presentation, which will be very straightforward, I just want to say a few words. You can note that I have a pink jacket this morning, and I have Game Over t-shirts underneath. There is a reason. Pink jacket is not here because the pink color symbolizes feminine culture. Pink jacket is there because in my home native country, Serbia, there is one TV station called Pink TV, which mastered character assassinations of all kinds towards the students and fellow faculty, university professors who are currently in the protest asking for systemic change there in Serbia. Pink TV is not the only one doing character assassination and doing systemic and organized campaigns towards those who are against the current regime in Serbia. So the point is that I will just take off this pink jacket and say game over to all those who want to do these kinds of character assassinations, and please allow me to express my support to students and to fellow university professors who are now passing through very hard times. So. When it comes to character assassination, the topic of the research I'm doing actually came out of blue, came as an outcome of my discussion with one of friends who is a female politician. And we had a casual chat on the media reporting and the bizarre content that is published and so on and so forth. And she said, I don't mind. I don't mind putting myself into context of good-looking girl. So that was her response. And then I told myself, okay, well, it might be worth asking other female politicians from Serbia to understand whether they also perceive this narrative as positive. So I gave one example. This is State Secretary, and there is a text saying long legs and mini dress, Milena Ivanović, lit up social networks. Everyone is asking whether she's shining so much because of new love. So that's the narrative. And I wanted to understand how such narratives, which normally media narratives, and I'm talking about mainstream media, not about memes, not about deepfakes, not about any kind of social media content. So I'm strictly talking about mainstream media reporting. So how do they perceive the articles that emphasize their feminine characteristics and also traditional roles? So the objective is to understand whether female politicians of Serbia perceive such narratives as biased, sexist, or discriminatory, as it is the case in many other countries, and as it is the case in a huge body of literature we are having around. I put another text underneath, and I will need to translate this too. So, Hollywood actress Sharon Stone and Serbian sports minister Snežana Samardžić-Marković, 44 years old, are connected at least by 3 points. They are both blonde, they are born the same day, March 10th, and they love to wear sexy tights. Because of long legs and scene from Basic Instinct movie, Sharon Stone got worldwide fame. As Marković started, she also can expect more popularity with the male voters. So this is the narrative, followed by the photo of Snežana sitting on some sports event. Of course, legs crossed, she was in a normal dress, and you could see end of her stockings, basically. So this was the context behind it. And we are all familiar with that, females in politics are generally depicted in a different way than males. I would say that's not normal, but it is traditional. And there is a shift, and literature also proves that. There is a shift towards personality traits, family roles, and appearance when we have female candidates in a ballot. No doubt about it. We already spoke about the fact that this narrative is often perceived as biased, sexist, discriminatory, and so on and so forth. And also, some other literature sources claim that these are sources of suffering and distress for female politicians. So if we look into this context, then definitely it was worth examining what's going on there. And the research per se is simple as that. There is absolutely no rocket science. By the way, for my dear colleagues from the region, this is one of the examples. So this is from one neighboring country. It says, is this the most beautiful minister in the region? Irene is putting people off their legs, but what she did in the last few days surprised many in Serbia. So the main question for me was very simplistic. Are female politicians in Serbia really bothered with the media reporting that puts emphasis on all these aspects that are deemed critical in terms of appearance or traditional role? Methodology, again, no rocket science in it. Simple as that, 16 semi-structured interviews. Thank God I have good contact with many of them and good reports, so they were happy to talk about this. And what did I do? I showed them some examples of media reporting about them. And strange enough, they were ice cold. And some of them, 3 of them, even said, yeah, actually, I emphasized this. I told my PR team to push on this. So what we got out of 16 of them, 11 were completely fine, 3 were neutral, like I don't mind, and only 2 were a bit upset, but nothing major. So total opposite to what literature tells about this. And this is, now I'm in the stage of making a deep dive to try to figure out what could be the reason. Is the background cultural, which could be the case because Serbia, when you look into Hofstede, has a bit different characteristics than many other European countries in terms of dimensions of culture, looking more like some Arabic cultures or, I don't know, Turkish, Azerbaijan, and so on. So very unusual. Is that the reason? Or narrative is screwed to the level, to the extent where it became absolutely normal? Or there is something else? So the question is why this happens. And 3 of them actually encouraged their PR teams or journalists directly to report about them in the context I described. Here is another interesting example of current Minister of Education, by the way, who said a few days ago that university professors will not get their salaries because they did not teach the students, completely ignoring research and completely ignoring the fact that there is a protest on the street. So it says Slavica Đukić-Dejanović, Minister of Education, is even today, she is thankful to ex-wife of her husband. Ex-wife actually taught her actual husband to cook and be kind. So this is just illustration of content trivialization which happens around. And sometimes this is just a wake-up call for all of us. Sometimes we overlook the fact that content is trivialized, not only context. Content is trivialized as well. Here are examples of new boyfriends. So Darija Kisić, former Minister of Social Care, Darija Kisić showed a new boyfriend. A new choice of the Labor Minister is famous in the media sphere. And here is Deputy Prime Minister of Vojvodina Province Government, Sandra Božić, after divorce, again happy in love. We discover details of new romance of the politician. She is happy. So what we have now, we have strong discrepancy between literature, between some other findings, and the reports that I got through the interview responses. So still, I do not have the answer what is the root cause, to be frank with you. Maybe some future work until Mariana's call for special edition comes on the table will offer some possible answers based on limited sample you can have with 16 semi-structured interviews. But it definitely gives an indication that something is unusual. Let me be politically correct. Why is this important? It is important because this is the first time there is a research that analyzes the attitudes of Serbian female politicians in this context. It broadens the scope by offering a bit different perspective, a bit different and refreshing viewpoint. And maybe it is also food for thought to follow in the future, because woke seems to be a bit out of the context, to see what will happen with number of papers that deem actually this type of reporting as sexist, discriminatory, or whatever. So we'll see what will happen. But definitely, I hope I have not opened Pandora's box, but I hope I offered you some food for thought. And I really enjoyed performing this research, and I hope we will have some viable solutions. Thank you very much, and have a lovely day. Over to you, boss.
Thank you. I did not create a vision for how we want to do the Q&A with our presenters spread out across the room, but I will run microphones to presenters, and Serge will run microphones to questioners. I saw your hand first.
Thanks. Marko, I was very triggered by your presentation and all your arguments. Actually, I am a journalist and I have an experience in interviewing people. So I wanted to ask you, are you sure they were sincere in their answers? Because I believe that there's an explanation for what they told you. Maybe being cool about a negative media coverage of you, playing cool is a defense strategy, and maybe they're really offended. And a second note I would like to pose in this conversation is what they call internalized sexism. You see, that's a point that you may think about in the future of this research. Thank you.
Yeah, so interesting point. It would be ideal if I would be able to attach the electrodes and have neuroscientists along, so we can have the reality of saying the truth or not saying the truth. But no, I'm not going to drop my research because I may assume that someone is not telling the truth for the sake of not telling the truth. No, this is not going to happen. That's point number one. Point number two, internalized sexism is a possible case. It is a possible case, and it might be a possible reason for this. However, the question is, if we are having internalized sexism as a phenomenon, then if you are into politics, if you're a politically exposed person, then you go for this kind of narrative intentionally, and then you accept it. So then you play on it if the entire society has internalized sexism. Does Serbian society have it or not? I don't know. I could not find literature that would say either it does have or it doesn't have. So I could not find the evidence. I was behind it when I was studying and trying to find the root cause. But no, I could not find the background. So it could be a possible reason, but then in this case, then this kind of reporting becomes conscious choice of those female politicians. And then they are comfortable with it, if the entire society is like this.
Excellent. All right, Deirdre. On. All right.
Well, I also had a question on Marko's presentation. I wanted to ask about the contour. I'm not so familiar with Serbian politics reporting, so I wanted to ask about how male politicians tend to be reported on. Obviously, this made me laugh because it reminded me I like to read Daily Mail headlines. It's very much the style of Daily Mail celebrity reporting, you know, so-and-so stuns and plunging neckline, all the rest. So I was wondering, is there some celebritization of Serbian male political reporting? What that look like?
Yeah, there is a slant towards females in those terms. So you will not have too many. You can find occasionally, but very occasionally, reporting like this one about male politicians. But it is limited on maybe a few articles per year in hardcore tabloids. Whereas this kind of tabloidization actually went even towards those, I would say, semi-tabloid media. So it is not reserved only for tabloid media when it comes to females. When it comes to males, there was one ex-president for whom the strong argument was that he's good looking. But the narrative around his campaign and around his political appearances was not built in this way. There was word of mouth intentionally put in the campaign that he's looking good, he's presentable, and so on. But media narrative was not like this. So it is definitely skewed towards more reporting about females. So it's not anomaly of the entire media ecosystem. No, there is a slant towards females.
All right, I think maybe one more question. We'll see how long, but yes.
Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay, first question for Newly. I found your findings interesting and like somewhat very intuitive, but what was the most surprising among your findings? The second question is for Marko. I'm a social psychologist by training. So looking at that and hearing your you pondering about the causality, my first thought is, oh, experiment. So have you considered conducting experiments on this topic?
Okay, just to answer quickly, yes, some of them were, the findings were somewhat intuitive. What I found interesting was that the conservative outlets were not out and out negative toward her. The only negativity that came was from her judicial experience, and that's the only thing that they attacked repeatedly. So though the literature had talked about, criticizing her traits or maybe stereotypical coverage about her race and gender, I didn't see any of that. It was just focused entirely on how she had ruled in previous cases and just tying her very, very strongly to liberals and painting her as dangerous in that sense, but none of the other gendered stuff that I have seen in existing literature. So that was the most different thing.
Okay, and Marco, really quickly, and then I encourage you to
10 seconds. Wonderful idea. Was thinking about it, still unsure how to make it fully, but we can chat about it, and I would appreciate advice on this. So thought about it, yes, and likely I'll go for it.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I know that there are still questions on the floor, but we actually don't have a break scheduled between the start of our next panel. So the next panel is scheduled to start at 10, but maybe we take 5 real quickly as we load up the PowerPoint presentations. But please come ask your questions and share your thoughts with our presenters.